Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 11th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Interior Lines. The text follows. As a reaction against this false direction, another geometrical principle, that of the so-called interior lines, was then elevated to the throne. Although this principle rests on a sound foundation, on the truth that the combat is the only effectual means in war, still it is, just on account of its purely geometrical nature, nothing but another case of one-sided theory which can never gain ascendancy in the real world. So, very short paragraph this time, but introducing a great topic on its own, by all means, the one of interior lines. Now, explaining what interior lines are in a single video is not easy, and you can essentially hear, however, in these words, basically the reference to Humanism theory that we have mentioned on many occasions. And that, as you know, is a sort of a not necessarily an antagonistic view of von Clausewitz theory per se, but it's essentially the theory that at the time von Clausewitz was writing was gaining basically the greatest success in order to understand war through this positive approach that was based on essentially on a topological conception on the battlefield that stuck, let's say, to the combat dimension. Right? Von Clausewitz here doesn't mean to, in fact, to diminish, because he states that it was a healthy base on which this concept was built, but let's say that cannot be adopted as an effective theory of the art of war, because it's one-sided and starting just from a mere geometrical principle that is an abstraction. This paragraph comes just after the one we discussed last time, that criticized von Bülow's doctrine, that was objectively pretty weird, and that reduced everything on a purely geometrical result that von Clausewitz rightly defines as utterly useless, and that it's rightly so, really, because fundamentally von Bülow had made a sort of equilibristic passage from one dimension to another, arriving to claim at the end that the way to defeat the enemy is basically having a base of operation that depending on how it's located in correspondence to the enemy, is able fundamentally to dictate, well, the result of the fight. If the angles that passing, let's say, formed by the two lines that pass through the extremes of the geometrical shape of the base, converging on a distance of the enemy is 90 degrees or more, right? So this is a complete and utter abstraction that, even in that case, von Clausewitz explained, was starting by considering for the first time certain factors altogether in a synthesis, and that, however, degenerated in this completely and really purely abstract concept that finds no application in reality. Antoine-Henri de Jomini actually was a much deeper thinker, and actually, if we want to be honest, it would be more effective, didactically speaking, to teach his thought before, as an introduction, if you or maybe not, let's say just before studying the Vom Kriege, because objectively the humanist theory is quite interesting. It's important. It can't be simply dismissed by saying it's completely useless, because it does talk about very important things that have to do, of course, with combat, the means of resolution of war, and about very concrete things that, however, are basically detached from other concrete aspects of warfare. I frankly today, I was reading this paragraph before, talking about it. I was wondering whether we should really talk about humanist theory right now, because it's frankly a big chapter, and I'm not sure I can even have the current preparation to discuss this thoroughly. But I just trying to make you understand here. It's as if Humani. I mean, let's take battle, because this is what fundamentally Humani is mostly concentrated on, especially when, and obviously talking about combat. So for von Clausewitz, the battle, but also war. So that's where it extends, because theoretically this can be extended to the world war. Also for Humani's system, is a dynamic clash of moral forces that influence each other reciprocally, right? So for Humani instead, the battle is more simply and more directly a sort of topological puzzle that you can make of a sort of a geometrical picture of, right? So a clash between certain, let's say, abstract but also very concrete units at the same time that are taken as in fact a real object, but they are still conceived as ideal, right? It's a bit like we've been talking a lot about war gaming recently to exemplify essentially what this is. You know that war games, even in modern military theory, are very important because objectively the military trains through them, etc. But the concept of war gaming itself is that you're trying theoretically to simulate something that, however, is by definition simplified, right? Because there is no simulator that can simulate reality, right? And what war games try to do is essentially to make a compromise between the practical capabilities of, let's say, a fairly simplified system, like a map, in fact, with units, like with that are very intuitive concepts that can have some practical utility, and the impossibility, in fact, the infinity of reality, right? And the result as such is stopping to a very low point compared to instead what at least the Clausewitzian system talks to us about. Because for von Clausewitz there are essentially two major elements that teach you how to command, how to grow skilled in the art of warfare. First, direct military experience, right? Secondly, and obviously in positions of command, because I mean, war as military experience is always positive in this sense, but obviously the higher this is in terms of ranks and this, hierarchy, and the better it is in order to understand the wall, right? Contrarily wise to what certain, maybe not so many people, but because people tend to have more antipathy toward the politicians rather than for generals. But sometimes there is this stereotype that the general is a sort of heartless monster that doesn't understand what happens on the field, and gets people killed because of kind of abstract considerations. And there is all this criticism that, in part, I was thinking about War and Peace, where there is that passage, in fact, in which von Clausewitz appears with another German officer, another Prussian officer, that is criticized because he was saying something like, that everything sounded kind of abstract. In that case, I think it was about, however, the raison d'etat fundamentally, and that is more important than the individual and so on. And I think it was André in the book that listens to them passing and says, "Oh, these Germans, they can't, they come here teaching us what war is, and they can't even defend their own homeland because they had been occupied by Napoleon." So that is kind of funny because von Clausewitz actually went there. I mean, it's a real thing, meaning that aside from the literary imagination. But von Clausewitz, as you know, when Prussia was conquered and by and aligned to the French, he fled to Russia to keep on fighting against Napoleon. In fact, he was condemned to sentenced to death in Prussia by the pro-French government. So, well, because it was a big deal, because he was still an officer of the Prussian army, and he was defectioning to Russia, right? So, but aside from this story, the concept is that paradoxically, these military theories are somehow like the Clausewitzian one, since they are more complex than the more intuitive ones. They're looked upon with suspicion simply by people who do not get them. They don't understand them, right? This is kind of normal because fundamentally we'll distrust things that we do not know. We all have that kind of prejudice and attitude, but many people confuse this as a greater tendency of von Clausewitz towards abstraction, and therefore something that it may be very highly sophisticated as a concept, but is practically inapplicable or however very abstract. Instead here it's the other way around, right? And this is something that tricked the same militaryman at the time, because the Jomini was basically had an enormous success among the military, as we all often recall, while von Clausewitz had one among the civilians that is very, very meaningful in my opinion. Because and the military at that point was buying, in fact, Jomini's idea that by considering warfare as a sort of mechanism of geometric explanation, that according to what happened in proportions on the battlefield, certain positions, etc., you could fundamentally not achieve victory all the time, but by maximizing that purely geometrical concept to achieve victory more successfully. More easily in a kind of a substantial fashion, right? So the theoretical approach was very different from Clausewitz one, because naturally here they didn't quite believe that because theoretically if both armies had fought in that fashion that Jomini was teaching, theoretically they would have basically nullified the effect. So this is also controversial, because that makes you understand how impractical in certain terms that is. And it's an implicit admission that fundamentally there are other factors that at that point intervene, and some of them you can't even let's say foresee, right? Which is also what von Clausewitz is saying, in fact. But von Clausewitz has a different idea of this, because it basically says it's not that these things do not matter. In fact, in this paragraph, von Clausewitz states it openly, right? It says this theory, these principles rested on a sound foundation, right? On the truth that the combat is the only effectual means in war. It is true, and there are ways. Always remember that tactics, according to von Clausewitz, is that branch of the art of war in which a more positive result can be achieved. Which means, in other words, that it's first of all, tactics is easier than strategy because it's much simpler, systemically speaking. But at the same time, battles are intuitively understandable, right? This is what Jomini's theory is practically looking at. It's saying, let's make this a sort of an exercise by observing what, at history, both von Clausewitz and Jomini were, prominent military historians in the sense. I mean, they studied campaign after campaign. They had quite of a generalized interest for the history of warfare, and they recognized their importance in their theory as a kind of a positive, effectual mean, right, to improve the skill in the art of war. Excuse me, I didn't complete the sentence before, but what I was saying is that von Clausewitz says that military experience is necessary and is kind of the most important element to become skilled in the art of war. But military history, right? pure military history is a fulfillment. It enables you to fulfill these skills and to complete them, right? So military history has a real positive effect in this sense. So these two authors are actually talking at a different level, because von Clausewitz, as we have seen also, I don't know if you have followed now the other videos, but if you, in case you didn't, you can always look at this whole series in sequence, because that's also what the Vom Kriege should be studied like. But summing up briefly, of course, von Clausewitz states that, yeah, these principles, as it says here, can even be based on a sound concept. They can even maybe have some effect, but looking at the whole picture, that is in reality, which is the one that makes the difference and that is useful for, there are other massively overwhelming elements that intervene in here that basically such geometric schematizations do not take into consideration, right? And that can make the reliance on that system very dangerous, right? Because if you, it's not much about applying those concepts that actually, if you read the Précis de l'art de la guerre by Jomini, they're very, very interesting, very, very pointing. Let's say very sound concepts. In fact, there is all a very complex. There is nothing simplistic in it. If you study that theory, it's very, very well built. It's very coherent within itself in what Jomini is trying to say in there. But that's not the point, right? So you can't exclude Jomini. You can't exclude his work, like von Bülow's one that we read last time. But von Clausewitz simply goes beyond, and the same Jomini at one point admitted this, because he understood, as the intelligent man that he was, that von Clausewitz was right? So it's accepting fundamentally that there is, a dimension that goes beyond that brings to a more positive effect, right? And this is the one that takes into consideration a lot of other factors, especially the moral ones, that are fundamentally taken out by Jomini's theory, at least in regard to the general internal line principle for what it works like and what it's meant to represent. That change everything, right? And you have to, in this ocean of uncertainty and instability and unpredictability, you have to struggle in order to find what is the element that makes a difference. And that Jomini simply states, you just find it. It's just the way you deploy troops on the battlefield, right? And the reason why Jomini is interesting and important, should be read and studied as well, is that actually, this is an important concept. I mean, studying formations is very important. There are, I once read about the various offensive, the 12 types of offensive battles in the classification of Antoine-Henri de Jomini, which is in the 31st, if I'm not wrong, article of the 4th chapter in the Précis de la guerre, and it's very interesting. It's very interesting. In that sense, because now we know von Clausewitz, so we are already beyond. So Jomini's point of view can seem superficial by a certain dimension, but not for this reason, which it is compared to von Clausewitz's theory, but we don't have to underestimate it, because it, however, deals with lucidity on a very real aspect of war, right? There are Jomini, for example. Jomini's premise is that in every battle there is always an attacking army and one that defends and receives the defense position and receives the attack. The attacking one is not only loaded with enthusiasm, while the enemy is under the stress of waiting, but especially takes on the initiative, and by paying it with the negotiation of terrain that's separates it from the adversary, while the defending side capitalizes upon this factor with the perspective that he doesn't have to never to miss the opportunity to counterattack at the most propitious moment and taking the initiative once again in his own hands. And so like a defensive, let's say a passive defender that does not contest initiative to his own adversaries is not necessarily doomed, but at least is destined not to grasp the full fruit of victory, right? So these are concepts that also von Clausewitz partly shares. I mean, they are realistic thinking, and they're not wrong. I mean, there is a general consensus. These are things that even, I don't know, other military thinkers had realized in a certain sense. I mean, even Montecuccoli, if I'm not wrong, he writes similar things. He talks about interior lines himself, internal lines. So there is a lot, and so we don't have to, and everything in Humanism at this point transforms itself in looking at the battlefield, essentially, and to find a key in the terrain that is not really a key, let's say, this is also why Humanism is kind of loaded with finesse in his thinking, because it doesn't reason in terms like there is a battlefield, given battlefield, and two armies that have to approach in there is a point in the battlefield that is like the key of victory, right? Von Clausewitz also deals with this stuff. He talks about the fact that sometimes even the Schwerpunkt can be holding a position at a certain point, always given that that this changes constantly. But Jomini, in this sense, is a bit working mystic, because he gets to the point of saying, given that there are two formations that meet in the arena to fight, this you can't spot from an aerial point of view. Essentially, one spot where where there is a decisive action. There can be a decisive action, at least, and which requires, in this sense, a type of formation that, given the position of the troops of the two armies having met at that point, it's not much to be adapted on the battlefield, because the troops are already where they are, but rather in the way they are deployed. This is just for dealing with what the Jomini talks about, because a second warning in this sense is that if you look at Jomini's schemes, you can think they are somewhat simple, right? But it's wrong to think so. First of all, because also, as von Clausewitz says, things in war are objectively simple. Like formations have in the general principles of war, there is simplicity as a rule, right? You don't have to complicate excessively, even formation and tactics, etc., because you're going to pay that, for example, in communications, or in I don't know, in the coordination in general, and in also the multiplication of joints where things can go wrong, etc. So what von Clausewitz sees is a dynamic, let's say, deployment that can't change at once, and it's always fluid, because the situation is always fluid. So you may be needing to do many things, including maybe changing certain dispositions on the field, and trying to fundamentally to maximize the effect on the base of what you can achieve at that given moment, which is very difficult. So that not even von Clausewitz says things like you have to start doing evolutions in the middle of the battlefield for no reason, but he stresses the mostly unframeable set of options that produce them, let's say, of situations more than else, that present themselves on the battlefield, for which you cannot stay to a fixed system. The humanist instead says, no, you can essentially have this type of deployment that for some reason you should at least be able to carry out at one point, and if you do so, you will maximize your options of winning. So this humanist one is definitely an abstraction, and you have to take them as such. But you have to work, however, with intelligence and with interpretative skills, because they, however, represent situations on a battlefield that can produce themselves, right, and that objectively have those kind of results, right? When you, if let's say the abstraction was real, right? If there wasn't any other factor that didn't intervene, right? And in this sense, it's, it works a bit by approximations, but it arrives at the point in which this approximation is excessive, because you arrive at the point that you have to deny reality, and certain other factors that come to nullify essentially the effectiveness of these formations, just for, in fact, moral or maybe other atmospheric conditions, or the fact that the troops have not eaten, or that there is a, I don't know, there is a command that does not arrive for whichever reason, right? And that therefore tries to say humanist system suffers of this account of purely geometrical nature that von Clausewitz talks about, and which, talking about this with von Clausewitz, is yet another case of one-sided theory, which can never gain ascendancy in the real world, right? Always reason it like this, that it's not a matter of what these theories want to do is essentially to have a positivistic approach to them. So to pretend that there is a science of war that, if you apply on the field, will solve all the problems. So, as we often said, science and art cannot exist one without the other. It's like, in fact, knowledge and action. You always need the two things, because if you have only knowledge but you don't know how to applicate that, that's good for nothing. As well as you can act, but you don't know, fundamentally you don't know what to do, so you're not good for nothing. So this, let's say, this concepts, to make it simple, rest on an over-reliance on the scientific side of the story, that basically arrives at the point of evaluating as a possibility, as a constant possibility, one of carrying out geometrical principles of interior lines, and that have, in this sense, a taste for abstraction that doesn't meet in real war. And von Clausewitz explains how fundamentally war is the field of human action which most is unknown, right? It's the situation in which things are pressured at a certain with a certain intensity, for which kind of the best resources, the most complicated human activities break free, let's say, in terms of forces, and you can't arrive to control them in any way. It's not just about humans themselves, but it's also about the environment and all what this entails. And I wouldn't like to leave you with the impression that humanity is useless. I don't. I do want to tell you how important it is, because humanity was really smart, and he perfectly understood that these formations, these geometrical principles, could not be applied in every circumstance. Right? Just take the battlefield. It can vary immensely. In there, Humanism would respond something like, yeah, that varies, so you can still, however, have these geometrical principles you can apply to. Yeah, you can do that. The problem is that you don't know whether all of these elements this geometrical principle is, for example, just take the enemy. I mean, the enemy can do something about this. I mean, it can do theoretically something stupid, but it can also do something that so that you can exploit. But it could be doing the same exact thing. In fact, Humanism's geometrical principles are normally applied to an enemy that is fundamentally passive, that has just a line, a frontal line, and that's pretty much it. So there is, for example, for attacking an enemy line, this combined order with a strong attack at the center and on a wing contemporarily, which is done by backing, essentially, doubling the line at one point in the center, refusing a little bit to the left, having the rest of the line continue on the right, and on the extreme right having a double, let's say, depth wing, right? And that, according to him, is for example, the concept of of military offensive rationality, according to the author, right? But at that point, that works if the enemy stays on his own line. What about the enemy does the same exact thing? And surprise, surprise, this actually happened, historically speaking. For example, because these principles are always there. I mean, the concept, for example, there is when at the beginning of the video I said that it's impossible to introduce the concept of interior lines because it's very, very complex, because it's really complex. It's a very complex theory. So, for example, you can argue that in war, there's always been, like, we talk a lot about medieval warfare, ancient warfare. All you see is that there is usually a center, the wings, a rear guard, vanguard. I mean, apparently, the battlefield gives you that illusion that everything is somehow simple. If you stick just to this aerial view of the battlefield, that entails fundamentally a bidimensional problem that, for example, takes time out of the equation in part. It doesn't consider moral factors, doesn't consider leadership. It doesn't consider other things that can intervene constantly on the field. Historically speaking, Humanism's system was a fruit of certain ideas. They were there since antiquity, right? All of these military theorists knew about them. In fact, that's why I was quoting Montecuccoli before and saying von Clausewitz, because this is obvious, right? There are certain principles that always remain the same. Flanking the enemy, attacking from the side, it's always been a big deal historically, and it still works, right? So it's obvious that in the way we are, humanly speaking, and the way we function individually and collectively, we do have in combat certain behaviors that kind of repeat themselves. Like, for example, there is something striking that in every battle, when the enemy, like one of the two armies is routing, there is always, for example, a bunch of people who exists till the end. That can be interpreted like a simple statistical, human characteristic that among a certain group of people there is someone who decides to make that sacrifice at the end in order to for many reasons that allows surely the others to escape in their place and to belate the slaughter, but sometimes it was just because of a political matter. I mean, and that's where von Clausewitz enters with the genius, because he understands that that what happens on the battlefield is also the product of politics and society. Right? People like to detach these things, and that means to deny the Clausewitzian theory, which is the base of which all our modern military theory is based. And guess why? Because it works, and there is no other way things work. Like, von Clausewitz didn't find a formula. like Humanity thought he had found, like a golden section of a geometrical principle. This von Clausewitz shows you effectively what works besides all of these conceptions. That is the genius, right? Because it has to take into consideration constantly, for example, that war is nothing but a political act by definition. So what happens on the field at that point, most of the times has nothing, or very few to do at least, with maybe how you deployed your troops, right? It can make a great difference. It can even be decisive at one point. But it's not necessarily that, and the problem is that most of the times we don't know much else, also historically speaking, or about let's say how certain let's say theories had been let's say how the quality, for example, of those units was, etc. But I was thinking, for example, it was during the 19th century overall this heavy reliance on this principle of interior lines, right? It does work. I mean, like when I don't know, at Gettysburg, for example, Pickett's charge, aside from Lee, but Longstreet, for example, had acknowledged the fact that also by certain geometrical calculations that they simply couldn't break the Union lines, and they were even doubting that still the Virginians would arrive as a as a formation with some physical consistence at Union lines. Because objectively, if you calculate certain aspects of the story, things can be foreseen in a certain way. There is a logic based on geometry, on physics in general, because it's not just geometry. But how much that will be determinant can vary over time. Can vary a lot because it can depend on many other factors, right? And this is the real problem. And historically speaking, just to end the concept we were starting before, for example, armies that functioned in a way that had understood the idea of reinforcing the right wing, we've seen it also in several battles that we'll discuss, were at the time of the Hellenistic armies that we talk frequently about. The other day we made a video on Seleucid army. Well, the first armies that started to systematize this order of battle, right, understanding that kind of the right wing had to be the stronger one, then there had to be a center with a certain consistency, and maybe the left flank could even be partly, not necessarily refused, but still being kind of less effective, was there. And guess what? First of all, this happened like even against foreign armies, right? At one point it was kind of like a race between the respective right wings that kind of pushed through what was normally the weaker left wing of the enemy, and who achieved like flanking and circling first could claim victory in that sense, to make it very, very ideal. But the armies of Alexander functioned more like that, and one of his successors basically sclerotized this formation, so that basically was no fantasy nor invented, but at least apparently that rendered the concept kind of useless, because it was true at that point that things were fought in that way. But what is going to make the difference? Also, classical warfare, because some of you could say, well, this is a case of symmetry in war. Well, there's never such a thing like symmetry in war, but definitely you were talking about two armies that were culturally homogeneous, that fought. I mean, think about all the wars of the Diadochi in that sense. that used the same tactic, that they had the same troops. That happened is that battles arrived to be kind of a, we will have to talk about this in Hellenistic warfare, that they became kind of ritualized battles, right? I have kind of a different opinion, but I think a better example of that is Hellenic classical warfare. If you take Hellenic classical warfare, you realize the Vulgates, before the Hellenistic warfare, Greeks fought, generally speaking, the same way, right? And especially in the motherland, because many people think that the Greeks exported their phalanxes elsewhere, but this actually never happened, because even if the order, the political and military organization was similar, however, for example, even outside the Hellenic motherland in the colonies, the phalanx basically decayed very, very quickly, because that was a kind of warfare that had developed locally with certain terrain characteristics, with certain cultural homogeneity, etc. And you can say, oh well, Greeks fought basically that same way, and therefore there is such a thing like a typical hoplitic battle. Well, if you study that warfare, Hellenic classical warfare, find me one battle that is actually, alike another, and into which actually the deployment was the same, and into which the outcome was dictated by the same circumstances. Do it in military history, because military history is literally the testing ground of this, and that's why minds like the one of von Clausewitz and Jomini and many other military theorists were all about this and understood the importance of military history, because it's real. It's not just a matter of armchair generals. Like, of course, without military theory, without military practice of command, it's almost nearly impossible to become skilled in the art of war. But without military knowledge of military history, not even the military commander is actually a big deal, can fulfill its skills. Let's say his potential, because he needs that. He needs that experience. Well, I'll answer for you. You will never find a battle that was the same. You will never find a type of warfare, not even in Hellenistic warfare, that seems so close, like between these two big phalanxes that things evolved. You can't find exactly the same battle, exactly the same tactics, exactly the same elements that had the outcome being decided in a certain way. You don't, because there is not, because there are other factors that intervene. Other factors. So you can have, I use the example of Hellenistic warfare because of the similarity of formation, like the one that Jomini is presenting in theory, even bearing in mind that the enemy could have applied the same exact formation, right, from the other side, and rendering a specular situation of stall, in which evidently there are other factors at that point come into play, if they haven't already happened. I mean, like in terms of the quality of the troops and of the same of the general conditions of the field, of the environment, etc. But more than that, it's basically trying to reduce everything to a purely geometrical principle that doesn't bring to a real concrete effect at the end of the day, that is in terms of gaining victory or not. That's the real point. And I realize that it's counterintuitive, believe me, because I realize that no matter how many times von Clausewitz will be explained in these terms and how much this thing will be highlighted, it's normal, I would say, even especially for a modern thinking, to pretend that battles are wars are won for technicistical things, for by explaining them with mechanicistic approach. Like, that guy should have used that other thing. Well, what do you know what the situation was on a battlefield? How can you pretend that you even know what it means to be there? How can you think that people who fight on a battlefield even know what is going on? 3/4 of what is going on, by definition, is unknown out there. By definition, 3/4. So what's the difference in terms of outcome that can make a deployment rather than another by itself? I mean, by itself. Which doesn't mean that in the sense that the formation has nothing to do with the general circumstances, but that's exactly the point that makes the whole thing jumping, right? Collapsing, I mean. Because if you know that part of your troops are not up to certain to carry out a certain tactical duty, you have to give up the idea that that preset deployment can be applicated and can effectively work, right? At that point, you will have to change another one to find another one, and at that point, will make some effect. Most of the times it's not decisive, but can be determined. It can help in that sense. But that's exactly the point. The deployment can have an influence, like many other things, right? But most of the times you cannot know whether that's the real problem or not. And whoever studies battles has analyzed, I won't say campaigns in general, because that would be the complete picture, but if we really want just to stick to tactics, that however brings those other factors on the field, so that's why also you need strategy to understand certain things, because not all armies are alike, in the sense that they also haven't had the same background before coming to the field of that battle. The possibility of solving war in a preset fashion doesn't hold, right? There are certain general principles that are valid, let's say most of the times, we can say. There are certain principles of war, but that's it. They are fluid. It's as if you had some cards to play, and in a scenario in which you don't really know what the rules are, and you will probably not know until the engagement is over. Maybe not even after that. That's really how it is, right? So, and I know this goes against any modern attitude, right? It's instinctive attitude. We have been grown with the idea that you can't solve every problem with a formula. That formula can be applied and your problem solved, right? Things are way more difficult, and we all know about that. It's not about the formula; it's about reconsidering what you're doing. Like it's like when you write a thesis, like you write a text of some sort. Now you have some concept in mind, and it seems to you that works. Then you put it on paper, and you start realizing at that point that maybe the concept, you're still following it, right? But there are many other things that are coming out in your mind that you were not aware of, and then you need other books to check, but you have problems because you have to get to one library, and maybe you're lazy, and maybe you don't have time, and that starts messing up the thing at the point that what you thought you would write by starting the text is very different from what you had, from what you will achieve, right? So that's like it happened. In war, this thing is multiplied more than in other human activity, right? This effect is dramatically amplified, because the things that are stake are let's say produce a much greater variety of options. It's a dramatically more complicated system that needs to be thought thoroughly, carefully. I mean, it's particularly important. It may seem strange. I mean that we haven't still recognized fully the genius of von Clausewitz. And naturally, I don't pretend you. I mean, if you maybe if you listen to these videos for the first time, or you simply are curious, here we're making a general, you know, let's say analysis, let's say this way, of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, right? And we don't really, you know, we have specified many times that we have to take things in serious matter, step by step, right? So you can't learn from Clausewitz in the blink of an eye. But especially you can't learn from Clausewitz if you don't, let's say, open completely to the idea that your notions about what you knew before about war can be easily radically wrong. And this is probably the most difficult thing to accept. It's not a matter of even understand, because von Clausewitz is difficult, but it's difficult exactly because we have prejudices, and prejudices are difficult to break, because otherwise von Clausewitz writes beautifully, explains, if you want, in a very simple way, step by step. Then eventually what gets seriously complex and complicated is, maybe complex is enough, is to keep everything in mind. Von Clausewitz had it all in his mind, right? You know, and he wrote it down for us. Now, if you have problem to follow him, it's not his fault, because he writes beautifully and he's extremely effective and very, very intelligent, exactly in stressing the element that makes the difference, and that will eventually be useful for us, for real, right? In other words, you can, let's say, remain with an idea that you know, if you distrust from Clausewitz that maybe this idea is that you know, you don't accept the fact that there is no scientific approach to war, because you think that, you know, if you know theoretically everything, that can work. Yes, but there is no human mind that can achieve that. That's also another way to criticize humanist thinking, because the same von Clausewitz accepts that the way to solve war would be to know everything about it, scientifically speaking. That is to say, to know literally everything that is going on. The real problem is that we don't know what it happens most of the times, and not just because of a merely intellectual problem. It's literally a matter of feelings, emotions, perceptions. It's not easy. Secondly, simply we can't, because we can't process more than certain complicated, sort out more than certain systems in terms of dimensionally speaking. I mean, we have an intrinsic limit, right? So given this, and he explains this in the first book that we have already finished, but what he presents you with is that the denial of a positive take on the theory of the art of war is to say you can't have a science, because that science cannot be achieved. Science meant as knowledge, right? There is not. That can help, because the same von Clausewitz says, fine, the more you know, the better it is, for sure. The problem is that as a human being, doesn't matter how much you will be able to know, still what happens in war is overwhelming for you and for any other's mind. So in this, you don't have to give up saying, well, okay, then we are going out there as blind men, right? No, because if you are set on a right track, if you are aware of certain things, you definitely, you will not necessarily win, but you will be more effectively ready to counter certain problems, because you may know in the first place that they exist, which previously you did not. Rather than try to find this, to solve this puzzle that Humanism was presenting you with, and from a mathematical point of view, which, as we've just said, cannot be achieved because the system is too complex, right? So it's not that the Jovini was wrong in the measure in which he was thinking about, you know, certain strengths, or aside from the fact that in part he's abstract, right? So that you know, let's assume that you could it's like building up a war game and adding an infinite number of rules that correspond to the infinite aspects of warfare. The problem in that is that first of all, at one point you will not be able to remember them. In a real war, that's not a war game. That's things are going on independently from that. But secondly, the problem is that most of the times you don't even know how reality works. So at that point, it's not a matter of adding step by step a new rule or a new thing. It's even having the impossible task of understanding how all these factors actually interact with one another, and in which measure, in which degree. And no person is able, no machine will ever, no intelligence will be ever able to sort it out. Never. Because it's an infinite amount of information and it can't be sorted out. There's no way out. So it's dramatic. It's dramatic, right? Von Clausewitz says you do need knowledge for action. But at the same time, you can't need just knowledge in order to act. Or at least you will never get to that level of knowledge that is sufficient in order to make action, let's say, successful at most of your at the greatest of your potential, of your, let's say, realistic potential, right? So I know it sounds a bit I don't know how it sounds from the other side, telling you the truth, but that's what we are trying to explain now from quite some time, and I hope that the generals, the essentials, have been absorbed, right? If you're not secure about this, you can restart. You can pick the Vom Kriege instead of listening to me. That I'm actually not so effective as von Clausewitz, for goodness sake. But you can pick up the Vom Kriege and read it and studying it, right? And trying to understand what it really says, right? Because the first take is, you know, reading the book as if it was something you can read under the shade on the beach, right? And that's not really the kind of book. They're not for taste of topic, but for complexity of thinking. It's like studying hard on a certain system. So, and I must say that, you know, von Clausewitz, aside from certain minimal passages, because, you know, you can't fully translate certain languages, I mean languages in general, in everything. Like, you know, the problem with the Vom Kriege is that it's beautiful because it states many things in this beautiful language that is German, in a way that it's difficult to express. German in certain definitions is untranslatable, right, properly. It can't fully be rendered in another language. Also the same concept of Schwerpunkt, that it's very difficult to define, and also in the same Clausewitz in theory, for example, we don't have a full for example, a full definition of it. Like there is a series of considerations on it. Consider that von Clausewitz he actually had finished just the first book. So the first book is the only complete one that we really know, and that we can't really read by saying, this is what had to turn out like, right? This is quite important because it's not much of von Clausewitz's fault if he died. Fortunately for us, at least, this happened a few months before actually giving the final form to the before finishing the work, actually, and that's what he says, that he died, I think, in November, and he was about to, he thought he would have finished him by February, right? So what we have is mostly what yeah, it's basically the full developed work, let's be honest about it. But there are still certain things probably he would have written better, that he would have tried to define more precisely. But at the same time, you can see that he, in the way he explains, he doesn't quite need you to operate definitions, because it's not in the spirit, in the philosophy of his approach. His approach wants to make you understand that there is not a let's say an axiomatic, or let's say better, there are axiomatic relations, but these have to be found out by yourself, so that you have to, in their proportions. That's the real point. And nobody can prepare you for that but experience. That's what it's telling you, right? So we can obviously sum up certain concepts by experience and knowing that they will generally work, but they will never work in the same way, and especially that way can make the difference in that battle, especially when or in war in general, when it's combined with other factors. So he doesn't need you to find a maxim, a definition, a categorization simply by applying it blindly, but essentially to make you aware about the reality and the complexity of the thing, which in turn defines a system, right? Von Clausewitz is kind of anti-system, but he ends up making a system on its own, but it's radically different from the others, because it doesn't start from a positive reliance, a blind faith in the positive approach, but he develops everything according to a rigorous method and analysis that reveals you, if anything, more the uncertainty of the whole thing, and how to cope with that accordingly in an effective way. So the great difference at the end of the day, it's not a matter of opinion or interpretation, because this work is designed, is formulated to be really applicated, right? To have not the work itself, but that is supposed to make a difference. And what we know, because the whole world uses it, it is how it really is, right? Out there, and Humanism principles and similar ones are not. And guess why? Because the results you can achieve through Clausewitzian theory are greater than any other system that has ever been created. And this is based not on a positivistic take on reality, but on the reverse. So that is a thing. That is a thing. Because when you think about progress, we don't think about things that will always work, because there's this blind faith into progress, right? There's never been such thing historically speaking. I mean, people have had it, but reality has always gone quite in a different way. And all accomplishments have been mostly a consequence of a failure than the consequences of a positivistic victory, right? So, of a positive victory, let's say better. So, I care especially about this concept, and von Clausewitz did too, because that's what he taught us, right? And and there would be a lot of other things to say here, because naturally, always bear in mind that von Clausewitz stems from a specific historical background, but he, in this sense, he's not biased by that, but he's determined by that. That he's, if there hadn't been Napoleonic Wars, we would have not had von Clausewitz, right? Maybe there would have been someone else, or maybe not. Interestingly enough, because I doubt that any mind has been able to do what von Clausewitz has done, at least in relatively to this field of human knowledge, meaning that of course there have been enormous geniuses throughout history, but talking about theory of war, definitely von Clausewitz is not struggling for the top. He's at the top and distancing everybody by really far. I mean, it's completely on a different level by anyone else, from anyone else. So I care about these perspectives because if you really search, because when we study military history, I believe that what we really care about is being correct. Like there is a degree of accuracy, of reliability that we seek, and that military history attracts because it has to do with rationality at the end of the day, right? And the way we argue about it, the way we have discussions about it, it's at the end of the day to draw a logical, coherent, and rational picture of the world. This is important, and you can see it easily in terms of even in historiography, that the most prominent and famous and effective military historians come from a rational and anti-dogmatic background. So military history in this sense has a terrific usefulness for all of society. I don't want to expand on this now because we already discussed it here and there. Now maybe we don't have time, but the point is that if you really search, coming back to the military historian who wants to know more, if you really search for someone who doesn't tell you, let's say, fairy tales, you can read von Clausewitz by knowing that he's telling you, I struggle to say it, but it's fundamentally the truth, right? It's not a truth in metaphysical terms, like it's a truth in human terms, like it's how far we can achieve, right? And I personally have this is not me. I love 18th century. Let's say I love Kant, for example. I have a great interest for the philosophical background from which the same von Clausewitz was coming from. But I believe that there are certain principles that essentially across the 19th century haven't been surpassed, and that we have had a crisis in terms of beliefs, of values that goes beyond, I mean, certain traditions or identities. It has to do with the ability of our of making use of our mind that these people had at the time. Well, of course, this educated kind of genius-like figures, but do you know of similar thinkers today? No. All you hear about is a bunch of morons who, have, the care only about social networks, and that's it, right? That's the thing. We rarely have such recognition for intelligence, because at the end of the day, we, especially when we are particularly stupid or not very gifted, we actually despise intelligence, we distrust intelligence. So it's very difficult today to acquire that level of intellectual commitment, because essentially society pushes you by saying, okay, basically we can't do everything, almost effortless, or at least everything is easier, and you as a consequence you immediately relax. These were very different times, and that has an impact in my opinion. So and another danger in this sense is moral relativism. If you are a moral relativist in this sense, and you dismiss ideas and thoughts simply because you decide that you already have a general understanding of more or less everything, well, that will render you blind, will make you see everything flatly equal, right? And while nothing is. And it's a great problem. Like, knowledge is a problem by itself. It's difficult to handle. It's not easy. It's extremely challenging. But nevertheless, that's the best you can do. And von Clausewitz explains you why. So he offers you um, some of the best knowledge the human civilization has ever produced for free, aside from your intellectual commitment. But let's say it's worth it. Like, it's something you want to pay if you're really interested in such topics. Like, in my opinion, there is nothing like this, right? I have difficulties. Maybe I'm just because I'm probably also ignorant. I'm sure, but I've read my share of stuff in my life, several fields, and I've personally never met an intellect like this yet, right? When it gets in the field of exact sciences, of course, you can find great geniuses, extremely talented people. I'm not saying that. I don't know. You talk about astrophysics, that were not equivalent to Foucault, but the social sciences, like war, are much different, right? They have to surpass certain stereotypes and BS, and that a scientist practically may not. I mean, can have, maybe because he's fascinated by a certain theory, etc. But that goes beyond, because they're substantially different thing. You can have a person who can solve some of the most complicated equations, but maybe he's a jerk in life. He has no discipline, no morality, well, studying war is much more than that. It's not a mere intellectual exercise. It's also becoming a better person, right? And understanding what effect does it make to take a decision rather than another, right? And that in war is particularly evident as in potential. So aside, now I'm just digressing, but it's embarrassing how I brutally I made a brutal synthesis of Yomini, but I'll tell you, we will have to talk about him very thoroughly at one point. I don't know, frankly, when and how, but just read the Précis de l'art de la guerre if you can. It's worth it, and if you have enough time. I mean, if you have to choose, obviously study from Clausewitz. But if you have enough time, and you really want to get your mind blown, first study Yomini and then study from Clausewitz, because that's powerful. That's a factor. I'm sure the difference in potential can help you a lot as a lesson learned about these two authors. So aside from this, okay, for today, let's finish it here. And next time we will see how all these attempts are open to objection, which means, we have to refuse them all. Yeah, that's literally what it means. And so we'll go on, kind of expanding also a bit longer paragraphs. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.